You're so righteous.
This is also true.
Good Lord, man!
I don't buy the pig in the hole.
Carry on like a man.
It's the guys, let me go find out tonight.
Hey there, Carol.
What are you doing here?
Oh, my house burned down. And I need to take a long, hot shower. So where are you off to? Looking so pretty.
I am aware of the effect I have on women.
So here is a real DM that I got yesterday morning.
Hey, I am a super huge fan and I love the light work video you made about Ice Cube. I just have a question. Are you circumcised?
What?
Is it something culturally significant to Black people? Thank you. I love your videos.
Now, I'm sure I'm not the only person to get weird and kind of creepy DMs. Whenever you are a public figure, that is something that will happen. I'm sure that, you know, women in my position get worse stuff, but I couldn't help feel this one was unique on some levels because it reminded me of an experience that Foreign Man in a Foreign Land went through a little while back. If you watch my channel, it's likely that you're at least somewhat aware of Foreign Man in a Foreign Land. He and I met on the BreadTube Reddit boards a few years ago as middling small channels. We immediately gelled and have been crossing over ever since. One thing that makes him special is that among other left-leaning men on this platform, he stands out as one of the most traditionally masculine presenting. He's from the traditionally conservative Caribbean. In his words, he is a big Black man with a beard. He's newly engaged. He even practices Brazilian jiu-jitsu, so he can whoop your ass. But he also plays the piano. He sings. He's an advocate for sexual minorities, even to his own detriment, being from the Caribbean. And he's a very compassionate and empathetic guy underneath the classically masculine veneer. However, to a lot of the world, none of that other stuff underneath the blackness and the beard matters. We know this. We know how police profile Black men. We know the ways that financial or educational institutions will treat Black men. Foreign has talked about being pulled over, disregarded, and scrutinized by his college, assumed to be on a football scholarship. But it's a recent incident akin to this DM I got that let me know that I want to start off this topic in this video with his story.
OnlyFans, right? One problem though. I ain't never made one. I wake up to one message that broke my belly right down. Next time you go on to bed, try this. It clean you right out. I want my money back. Right now. I tell him I'll be happy to refund them. I just want to know why he leaving. And you should have heard the screams that I scrum when he tell me why. $50 a month and you charge extra for pics. I couldn't even fix my fingers to reply to this yummy. I say so. This Patreon. None of my tears say anything about me setting Willie free. I'm talking about your OnlyFans. This boy must see dunking BDs and embalming fluid. Must see sucking off a jitney exhaust. Cause that's impossible. I don't have an OnlyFans. Please send me the link. And I swear either this wasn't your regular schmegular OnlyFans. This a race play fetish OnlyFans.
A supposed fan, someone who liked Foreign enough to pay for access to his content, violated Foreign Man in a way that isn't maybe unique to Black men, but Black men are uniquely limited in our ability to process and address these types of violations. As Black men who dare to be in the public eye, Foreign and I both have to constantly maneuver a lot of precarious situations as it pertains to race. But what many people often don't see with Black men is how sex and the voyeuristic gaze of the world is always upon Black men. It's a form of dehumanization, violation, and kind of ungendering unique to Black people, and relatively speaking, underinvestigated when it comes to Black men. And this is greatly because Black men's unique intersection of Blackness and maleness renders us both highly susceptible to sexual violence and exploitation, and systemically and culturally crippled in our ability to confront said violence due to the tropes and themes attached to our bodies, to the point where the violation of our sexual autonomy is almost normalized. But it's not all negative. There's a lot more to talk about with Black men and sex than the struggles. Despite the precarious nature of Black men's sexual experiences in America, Black men still manage to seek, give, and receive pleasure in our sexual encounters. And while the lines between appreciation and fetishization are often blurred, Black men's sexuality has lived rent-free in the minds of people who desire men for generations. This paradox between these two extremes, both the horror and the honorifics of Black men's sexuality, is what I'm hoping to explore in this video. video to examine the tropes, stereotypes, and unpack the truths that they tend to hide, to engage in black men's sexual experiences as a subject instead of an object. And I'm going to do that by looking at the ways that black men have expressed themselves through music, visual arts, fashion, dance, literature, etc., as well as adding the voices of men who help me collect my thoughts and share their own around the various issues and topics that black men engage with around sex.
One of my sons said a boy, he heard a fourth grader at his school tell somebody that suck his private.
Right.
And he asked me, well, what does that mean?
What does that mean? Yeah.
What is that? First of all, what is the word? What are the words that he's saying? You know what I'm saying? What are these words? And I'm what can I tell him? Oh no, I'll tell you later. No, I gotta let him know now. Yeah, because if I don't tell him, guess what he gonna do? He'll go up to that fourth grade. Hey, what did you mean by that?
Right.
And then who would I rather he hear from? Me or the fourth grade?
Well, originally, how black people were here treated and expected to go out and continue to make black families. But after being oppressed, after being herded and cattled, bred like animals, how are you going to then expect these people to go on and understand pleasure, sex pleasurably? No, sex has been demonized to us. The idea of sex being pleasurable was stolen, beaten out of us, really.
And it ties into the hypermasculine idea. I find my experience is generally, it's a feast or famine thing, because for the most part, being a black male queer sex worker is rare. But then on another level, if somebody people can ignore certain aspects and cater to certain aspects. So if they only want to see me as a black man, then that's not that rare. So my experience kind of wavers between being celebrated and being appreciated highly for the endowment and the physicality, to being rapidly and quickly discarded. Religion and slavery and all this. I don't want all that shit. I just want a black man and a big dick. So so there are times where I'm really treated invisible because they're like, yo, this is sex work. We don't want somebody who's educating about sexual history and slavery and racism and sexism and capitalism and how it all ties in together. I just want to get my nut off.
And I'm telling you right now, at that moment, I realized that as many times as I had sex, I was in a new realm when it came to this woman, because she's done a lot and she likes a lot, and she views sex as art. And I said, well, I'm used to using my main phallic symbol. That's my tool. That's it. I'm sitting there and I'm watching them do things to her without their dick. They don't have a penis. And they're working her way further than I've ever done in life up until that point. And now I'm like, yo, I got to get my tool bag together. My tool bag only has one tool in it. And they don't even have it. And they're going crazy.
They surpassed me already.
They surpassed me first time. One time. Surpassed.
But first, let's talk about today's perfectly aligned sponsor, who I need you to support because there's a high chance that this video will be demonetized. In fact, I don't know if some of y'all gonna feel some of the stuff I gotta say here. But first, it's time for the sponsor. So if you clicked on this thumbnail and looked at the timestamp, you probably know that the contents of this video are going to be long and very difficult to take. What I'm alluding to here is that although some parts of this video will be very heavy and difficult to discuss, I did want to have some level of levity, because the reality of this discussion is that so much of what we're talking about is sex. And that's because I think sex is amazing. And I'm talking about whatever type of sex you might be into. If you're into sex, I hope you're doing it. I hope you're doing a lot of it. I hope you're doing it well and safely. And I hope you're maybe enhancing it with the help of today's sponsor, AdamandEve.com. Adam and Eve is an online adult store which offers a bevy of toys for you or your partner or partners, or whatever permutation that brings you pleasure. They can help you, and they can help you for a lot less than running to the local store that you might have in your hometown. And if you're unlike me and you live maybe somewhere that is more rural, you kind of can't find much of this stuff anywhere, but you can find it on adamandeve.com. And you can get at least one item today for 50% off by clicking the link in the description and using my promo code. This will also get you free shipping and handling to the US or Canada. It will come in a discreet package and with the peace of mind that if you somehow don't like what you've bought, you'll have 90 days to return it with no hassle. Videos like this are a challenge to keep monetized, so I really appreciate Adam and Eve for stepping in to sponsor this video. So please, if you appreciate the channel, show your appreciation for them and for yourself by clicking the link in the description. Thank you very much to Adam and Eve for sponsoring the video, and now back to the video. So I'm going to start off with my friend D. Me and D actually go all the way back to probably the 2nd grade when his mom and my aunt connected and realized that we lived down the street from each other. Me and D were fast friends and bonded the same way most boys our age did, sports and video games, or more likely sports video games. I was always better at video games and D was much better at sports. Unsurprisingly, after we hit puberty, something started to make us grow apart a little bit. In middle school, D moved away and I barely saw him after that outside of a few random visits, a few summer camps and parties. In those fleeting moments, I recognized how D had matured in ways I hadn't. He didn't stumble over his words when talking to girls. He moved with the swagger I lacked. It was obvious to me that D was well ahead of me sexually, or so I thought. Me and D ended up enrolling in the same college without telling each other. We just randomly met up those first 2 days of school. I didn't know anyone else, and D had already collected a few other guys from Chicago that he knew from back home, and they all attended together. So it was natural for me to try to hang with them, even though they were a little ahead of me, much like D was in terms of maturity. I was an 18-year-old virgin who had only gotten to second base, and these dudes seemed like they had been collecting women since puberty, or so I thought.
From my perspective, so you know, I was a late bloomer and I was a slow burner when it came to like understanding how to engage with and deal with women, whereas you were pretty much the opposite. And so what was that experience like from your perspective? I know it wasn't always easy, right? But I do know that you never had a lot of issues attracting women from an early age.
But bro, it sounds so crazy to hear you say that, because I swear to other guys, you know what I'm saying, I was the newcomer, the slow burner, you know what I'm saying? I was thinking to myself like, damn, I'm still on one hand, you know what I'm saying? So look, G, like I was always the guy that everybody thought was getting all these cakes, but I wasn't. Or I might have had girls that liked me. But honestly, G, like I was the only child, man. So I had coming up, I was very quiet. You know what I'm saying? Like as I got older, a lot of stuff I didn't, I had a couple guys I could talk to. So I was kind of low key insecure about talking to girls. But the miraculous part about it, because I was the quiet guy, girls started liking that stuff.
When I talked to D, even in this moment at 40, this was a surprise to me. In my head, looking back at that time, D was just getting girls hand over foot. I vividly remember girls talking to me for the sole purpose of asking about him. Like a lot, but it goes to show how much mythology we attach to black men and their sexuality, that even knowing D personally, I still perceived him to be hypersexual at a younger age than he was. Now, don't get me wrong, D will tell you that he has gotten around, especially since those college days, but despite his powers and success early on, he was not as hot in the pants as I'd have imagined. It was my own insecurities and my own warped perception of what black men's sexuality was that led me all these years to think otherwise. So we need to unpack that mythology, and I'm proof of that. Why do we assume that black men are these prolific lovers with insatiable desires and huge penises? This is not a trope that I am just guilty of. This is a trope that is pretty universal and almost to the point of being passé in American and probably worldwide culture. As with so many aspects of black behavior and culture, at least in this country, to understand it, you kind of have to look back at chattel slavery and, better yet, what African sexuality looked like before colonization and enslavement. Despite the faux woke arguments from different ostensibly pro-black figures that you might have encountered on Twitter or in your freshman freshman dorm room or here on YouTube, African gender and sexual expression was not explicitly patriarchal by today's standards. Africa is and was a huge continent with a huge variety of cultures and peoples and traditions. There's evidence of pretty much any modern permutation of gender and sexual expression in numerous African cultures. I am not an expert on African history, pre or post colonization. I'll put a link to a channel that is really good on African history in the description, but a few Googles, preferably on Google Scholar, will yield you to tons of freely accessible research material to look into the variety of ways that Africans practice and experience sex, as well as the many ways that colonialism and eventually slavery flattened that variety into puritanical practices that inform much of African and Black American sex to this day. By puritanical, I mean of the nature of the Puritans, the first white settlers to make their way from Britain to America, who had very strict, very, by today's standards, extreme views on sex and gender. And it's that mindset that has informed a lot of Americans' conservative views on sex to this day. But not so much in Africa, whether it be the quasi-polyamorous actions of the Ila tribe in Zambia, or the controversial sexuality of one of Uganda's last kings before colonialism took over, or the focus and expectation of female orgasm and ejaculation that can be found in pre- and post-colonial Congo. While surely some African civilizations pre-colonization must have looked like our modern patriarchal and conservative images of sex and gender, that was not the case everywhere. It's hard to drill down on all the ways that colonization and especially Christianity changed the way that Black people viewed and experienced sex, but it's fair to say that it greatly stopped being an act of mutual pleasure and intimacy and started being an act of transaction or dominance and ownership, as well as violation. For the sake of the outside chance of keeping this video monetized, I'll avoid going into a lot of details with it, but I'll just say that enslaved and colonized Black men and women were subjected to the unspeakable regularly under American chattel slavery, one of the many things that separates American chattel slavery from other forms of slavery throughout world history. Enslaved Africans were not seen as human compared to the way slaves may have been seen at other times throughout world history, and that lack of humanity made the treatment of them more brutal and abhorrent. After slavery, things get a little more deep and complex. White supremacist social systems needed to manifest frameworks to continue to control, oppress, and exploit Black people even when they were no longer enslaved. Among many tools to justify continued degradation of Black people was the demonization of Black men as sexually aggressive, insatiable beasts who represented a danger to white women and girls. This characterization worked in tandem with white patriarchal systems of control and dominance. Dominance and rightful access to white women for white men only must be protected at all costs, thus justifying any form of oppression of Black men in the name of maintaining white feminine purity. Quick aside, this video will focus pretty much only on Black men and our experiences and won't take a lot of time to venture into how these same systems shape Black femininity. If you are interested in similarly styled videos that do focus on Black women, I suggest Intellectual Media's Black Femicide video, pretty much anything from T Noir and Khadijah Mbo, or if you do want to hear a Black man's perspective that touches on this issue, Lil Bill, friend of the channel, just released a great video that touches a lot on Black women's sexuality and treatment in America pre and post slavery. However, all of those videos will point to one thing that needs to be said and can't be sugarcoated. White women and white feminism is completely complicit in the oppression of Black people, especially Black men, something that is effectively illustrated by Black masculinity's philosopher, Dr. Tommy Curry. He states in his book, The Man Not,
closer attention to Black males throughout history shows that patriarchy is not an insular and gender-opposing system that protects all men while subjugating all women. Patriarchy stands apositionally to femininity as a self-regenerative system, both ideologically and biologically. It depends on white womanhood to enact its domestic terrorism and global imperialism.
It's important to point out that while Black men do benefit from patriarchy, a sociological belief that some Black masculinity scholars would seemingly disagree with, including the aforementioned Tommy Curry, but both Black male scholars and intersectional scholars recognize that the gender identity of Black men is and has always been in every way subordinate to white patriarchy, similarly as any women. And the debasement of Black men as sexual beings is a core feature of that subordination, which hinges on the image of Black men as violent beasts. In his book, Curry talks about Eldridge Cleaver, I've mentioned Cleaver before in the colorism video, and he is a perfect example of why I say we don't deify scholars and philosophers, as Cleaver was a Black Panther turned sexual predator, turned fashion designer, turned conservative Republican senatorial candidate. He is the epitome of a weird guy. I can't endorse him as a person, but his breakdown of the complex gender interrelations between white men and women and Black men and women in his essay, The Allegory of the Black Eunuch, stands as one of the more insightful, though brutal, examinations of race and sex you'll read. The point in bringing up Cleaver is to provide insight into the still ongoing fetishization of Black man's sexuality and how this fetishization played into not just my false perception of my friend's sexual activity, but also the perception and fetishization and dehumanization of Black men as a whole. For example, take the ongoing fetish of interracial cuckolding. This is the practice of allowing or encouraging one's wife or partner to have sex with a Black man. Black men in this scenario are often referred to as bucks or studs, terms that were commonly used to describe Black men in slavery, specifically Black men used for breeding. This stems from the same legacy of hypersexualization of Black male bodies, a fascination with Black phalluses. And man, this video is definitely not going to be monetizable, is it? Come on, YouTube, just let me keep the streak going.
And sometimes it's strictly sex work, where I could be called in a position to be like, hey, can you come in, dominate my wife, and then fuck her in front of me? And that was the request, and I was like, yeah, I'm able to do that. But then sometimes some people can look at it and see me and only expect that as my only frame of reference or expression of sexuality, and expect that, hey, you're a Black guy, you have to have a big dick, you have to be aggressive, and you have to not like kissing, or you have to like not be romantic, or so on and so forth. Yeah, we can sometimes like engage in race play, but like beyond the race play, we understand that it's a structure that has been created, and all of them are stereotypes and cliches, but we are all still human beings beyond this, and we all have minds, bodies, souls.
I tend not to yuck anyone's yum, and I personally find the racial implications and social dynamics fascinating within that particular fetish, but you can't deny that the nature of interracial cuckolding is inherently racist, and this is very often seen in the way it's depicted. The underlying message in this particular fetish is the depersonalization of Black men's bodies used as essentially sex toys by both white men and women, toys that ideally must embody the racist tropes of Black men as brutes in order to maximize the appeal of the taboo. In regards to this, Curry refers to Cleaver in terms of how this manifests into fetishizations and dehumanization and ungendering of Black men's bodies. For a time, the racist propaganda in colonialism, whites would attempt to effeminize Black African men as docile and feeble. But during slavery, as Black bodies became commodities, there also came a fascination with Black men's physiques and penises. Westernized thought and patriarchy, which had often championed physique and sexual vitality as a virtue, had to reconfigure to maintain the hierarchy of white men over Black men. Curry indicates that the story changed and it became that Black men's bodies were meant to carry burdens as animals, that they were ruled by their libidos and unable to have sense on their own and required the wisdom of white men to guide them into civility. Cleaver refers to this sentiment as white men positioning themselves as the omnipotent administrator, white men controlling the social hierarchy and thus the sexual agency of everyone underneath them. And for this to work, Cleaver indicates that white men needed to install themselves as the mind, while the Black man can only be the body, a body that must be fully under the control of white masculinity.
The white boy is made a man through the destruction of the Black male body, his conquering of the Black male beast. He is made the white man through his castration of the Black man, and through the use of the Black phallus as his own. As with Eldridge Cleaver's description of the omnipotent administrator, it is the immateriality of the white man, his physicality, that creates the drive to dominate and embody the hyperphysicality of the nigger. This is why he wants to fuck like a nigger, to sexually satiate his white wife.
Definitely not gonna get demonetized.
Definitely, they try to portray me as super uber masculine. I'm more of an emotional being. I'm more in tune with how I feel and stuff like that. Especially bringing my past of living half of my life in a feminine body, and having to deal with the pressures and the misogyny and the misogynoir, all that from the other end of the spectrum. And nobody really knows and understands trans men, trans masculinity, or that in a Black space. So I actually did my point as a way of exhibition, of showing people, you know, this is what a trans body looks like in progress of its transition. And this is it giving and receiving pleasure.
This may be surprised, but if you ask me, white men probably fetishize Black men's bodies the most. Although not always sexually from a space of gratification, but through this vicarious consumption of Black men's bodies. We see it mostly to me in sports, but also in porn, in the arts, etc. We see it in how white men sexualize and castrated Black men during lynches. And the most heinous acts of white terrorism from the past, from Rosewood to Tulsa to St. Louis, were often in the name of protecting the virtue of white women from Black men. Basically, since slavery, Black men's sexuality has been imprisoned by this intersection of racist and misandrous violence. And over time, as with many cultural taboos, in a conservative society, it has turned into genuine fetish and kink. Myths about the size of Black men's penis, Black men as excellent lovers, the celebration of idealized Black men's physiques, a bevy of sex toys meant to resemble the mythologized, disembodied phallus of Black men, along with more than a few jokes, tropes, and myths about Black men's sexuality. Things that aren't only fetishized by white men and women, but men and women of all races, Black women included, and Black men as well, as seen in my perception of my friend in college. But this is all the academic mumbo jumbo, though. The thing that we have to consider and really contend with and spend, I hope, more time with is how and why Black men today still participate in and or reject this image and what that means for us in terms of sex. To start, and this is something that will be repeated, of all the things stripped from us as men, this mythology is one thing that, while distorted, we still have some level of agency over, and in many ways it's a key component to some of us finding avenues for success and personal capital through our art. And we see that through the history of Black men in art. Jazz men definitely had their fair share of leading men, and even a few women who cross-dressed and performed as men, such as Gladys Bentley. But it was the blues which turned into rock and roll that exploded due to the gyrating hips, booming voices, and sweaty bodies of Black musicians whose musical talents were buoyed by their sexual desirability. Later, we see the growth of that exaggerated swag we've talked about a few times.
The way he leaps off of rooftops and flips backwards to face the camera before falling into a headfirst dive is just full of the exaggerated swagger of a Black teen.
We see in the unique ways in which Black men walk and talk and interact with each other and the world, and it becomes emblematic of a specific appeal, which later grows into hip hop and urban culture that has been so commodified and replicated that watered down versions of it are being reproduced around the world. Over time, the horrific process of dehumanizing Black men sexually grew into a one-of-a-kind cultural marker that in many ways has, for better or worse, become a badge of honor for some Black men. It is impossible not to internalize the stereotypes about Black man's sexuality as a Black man, whether you embody them or not. There is still a lot to contend with there. For men who are able to embody this stereotype on some level, it may offer opportunities for sexual partners, or in some cases even sex work, sugar mamas, or opportunities that hinge on that mythological appeal, but often at a cost. How often do Black men feel a sense of devaluing when they get that feeling that prospective partners seek access to their bodies versus intimate connections? And then they might be further gaslit as if their desire for intimacy or connection is seen as deviant and inappropriate for a real Black man. If you're like me, you're keeping a running tab of all the things that a real man can't do, and from drinking lemonade to wiping their ass. It's a long, interesting list.
If you have emotions as a man, you're looked at as weak. If you express yourself, you're looked at as weak or undesirable. You're supposed to be able to take it. You're supposed to be able to perform. You're not supposed to have anxiety. You're not supposed to feel anything. If you're if you're too freaky, you're gay. If you're too freaky, if you like anything that is way past pleasing a woman or just getting head, then it's something wrong with you.
Something
wrong with you, and you're put into this. What they would used to try to do is make gay the bashing equivalent to men. Like, oh, then you must be gay. You must like men. Like, Ma, please, that don't do nothing for me. That's stop.
Conversely, I was on the opposite end of that spectrum, not being overly affable and charismatic, let alone being pretty introverted, often made me feel inadequate and insecure about how I showed up. I was a late bloomer who didn't have the natural magnetism or confidence of some of my peers. My body didn't resemble the bodies of the black men I saw in pornography. My swag didn't match the swag of the black men I saw on TV. And my libido and curiosity about sex did not drive me to relentlessly pursue it. While I looked the part of a desirable black man for chunks of my life, I never felt comfortable in that space. Still, even lacking that internal sense of those features, in numerous scenarios, I would find myself in the crosshairs of overly aggressive women who assumed differently about who I was. And I don't think I'm alone in that there are a lot of men who might fit that idealized image of black men's sexual vitality that aren't overly interested in playing into that stereotype or find themselves uncomfortable being the crosshairs of desirability for so many people. In the mid-late 90s, there was a singer named D'Angelo who, despite only being like 5'8", was a huge black sex symbol, as well as an amazing musician, helping to create the neo-soul wave of that time period. His video, How Does It Feel, which was simply a long take of him singing the song in the nude and just staring seductively into the camera, is a watershed moment of inviting the female gaze as a black man. It was probably responsible for more than a few sexual awakenings at the turn of the millennium. However, D'Angelo was never fully comfortable as a sex symbol. He was the son of a Pentecostal preacher. He had had a difficult childhood and a slightly concerning marriage to fellow singer Angie Stone, who was well over a decade older than him and was instrumental early in his career. The pressures of the lifestyle got to him, and he eventually struggled with substance abuse and gained a lot of weight, which of course earned him significant ridicule for going from this idealized black man sex symbol to, you know, one of your uncles from around the way. He eventually bounced back, but his story typifies how the in-between of black man's experiences is often unheard and unseen and underappreciated. How it's easier and more comfortable to render that image of black masculinity pretty much invisible in order to maintain the fantasy and the mythology around black men and black sexuality. And as I exemplify, it's something that other black men and women can definitely be guilty of doing to each other. All that said, even having to balance these two extremes of how we show up in the world, black men have still managed to find ways to find beauty and agency and pleasure in their own sexuality. We have always found ways and opportunities to define sex for ourselves. Further, we have also found ways to expand on the ways that black men can be celebrated and desired and desire others. Let's return back to those musicians of the past. Music and melody seem to have a divine connection to black people. The rhythm of song and dance and motion is something that black people have been known for, both in America but also worldwide. Although this is another stereotype which isn't true for all black men, which anyone who's ever seen me dance can attest to. But as the crooners and jazz singers of the 20s and 30s turned into the blues and rock and roll singers of the 50s and 60s, black men were realizing something that we often don't fully acknowledge when it comes to men, which is that sex sells. D himself created an independent production titled The Penis Monologues that he ran locally and traveled throughout the country with for over a decade. It was a heartfelt and deep inspection of black man's sexuality and experiences that he wrote partially based on his own life. But it doesn't seem like a lot of men ever heard it.
Sex sells. Man, we did that first show. The tickets were sold out in an hour, like in a couple days. And I'm like, damn. And when we added another show, it was sold out. I'm like, man, this stuff make money. And at the end of the day, man, we did that show. We had women showing up in dominatrix outfits. And, man, it was a guy. It was 200. We had 250 seats for the first venue. I got a text from one of my guys. He said, dog, I just counted the people in here. He said, no exaggeration, it's 247 women and 3 men in here. At the Penis Monologues. He said, thank you. You are the man. Like, I ain't never had, he said, I can't lose tonight. You know what I'm saying? Like, as far as the numbers, you know what I'm saying? So what does that mean? Women want to know about male sexuality. They want to hear about what we have to say.
While not done through traditional means and how we think about selling sex to people, the way that we see women's bodies be displayed for sexual gratification and eye candy, we still see that men with the willpower and the courage to put their bodies to work can be met with riches. Hidden behind euphemism and innuendo, rock and roll of the 50s and 60s was exactly that. The term rock and roll itself is an old African American slang term for making love. And as rock and roll took over the radio airwaves, it was impossible not to recognize the unbridled sensuality of black men behind the microphones and on the stage. From the 60s to the 80s, we saw an amazing variety of black men expressing their sexuality in America. The original rock stars with their flashy suits and flamboyant hair gave way to the soulful crooners that literally helped birth a generation. Also, though closeted due to fears of the time, we also saw queer black men explode in visibility in the worlds of rock and roll and disco and eventually R&B, as well as politics.
Mr. Bayard Rustin. And the right to vote. What do you say?
And art and books. These black men were colorful and cruel, domineering and alluring, seductive and mysterious, all in an era where black men greatly had little control over how they were presented in the media, but they still found ways to get their points across.
What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger, I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, if I'm not the nigger here, and you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you got to find out why.
Variety that we lost in the Middle Passage and in colonization and slavery was starting to show itself again. So like clockwork, white supremacist structures were there to stifle it as much as possible. White American youth have always had the desire to commodify black art. The deep investment of white people in modern hip hop culture to the point where we're calling it internet culture or some bullshit is not new. It's just more aggressive in its need to consume and appropriate. But this same thing happened all through these eras of black music. The aforementioned desire for white folks to consume black bodies was still there, but also that same flattening effect that destroyed numerous African cultures to create black had a similar effect on a variety of European cultures to flatten all of that uniqueness into whiteness. Here's an unseen excerpt from my conversation with Super Eye Patch Wolf to kind of explain.
There was an indigenous Irish wolf for close to 10,000 years, and from what I read, that's around the time that basically a genealogy of a species just becomes its own thing, and like so there would be an actual subsect of Irish wolf. Cromwell came over from England and decided like no civilized land can have wolves in it, and like Irish people would keep wolves as pets, and he wiped every single one of them out. Wow. And they're just gone now, you know what I mean? And like that's one of the reasons I love wolves. You know, you learn little pieces of like, you know, how your history was really fucked with. We lost our cool witch religion, like everything, you know? Yeah. Oh, the good old Anglo-European culture.
Right.
So what the fuck are you talking about? You know, like where? Like, do you mean England? Do you mean Spain? Do you mean Portugal? Do you mean Italy? Like, do you mean like what do you mean? Right. And because all those places come with like, you know, very specific cultures and histories and all this kind of stuff.
Basically, to ensure that white supremacist systems in America held strong, it was important that differentiations between different European races and cultures essentially died over time. The unique experiences of various immigrant communities nationwide, many of which weren't even considered white when they arrived, slowly melted into bland Americana, shedding so much unique culture in the process. So it makes sense to an extent that when white youth get a taste of the flavor and beauty of cultures that haven't been flattened into whiteness, they can't help but dive in. Again, for the millionth time, if you're white and you want a useful way to think about how race is constructed, I suggest reading Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists, just to kind of make that last passage make a little bit more sense. But what I'm talking about has been depicted a million times in the movies, that moment where a white person gets a first taste of that black experience. I get it. I hate it, but I get why a lot of white folks have historically sought to consume the unique aesthetics and art born out of the black experience, or now, I don't know, K-pop or Japan, etc. This has always created a paradox for those omnipotent administrators of these white supremacist systems. Black art is popular and possibly lucrative, but it's subversive, so how can we commodify it without losing control? Some of these white kids might accidentally rethink the racial dynamics we've been instilling in them this entire time. They might fuck around and start marching for the rights of black people. That might even lead to the dreaded miscegenation. These black male brutes may debase our virtuous white daughters. These insatiable Jezebels may entice white men out of their senses and responsibilities as white patriarchs. But we gotta make money. The most common thing was to try to keep black music and sex in control, which worked only as far as black musicians learned their actual economic power of their art. Black rock musicians began to refuse to play to segregated audiences or the South altogether. And over time, the legacy of the racial taboo began to backfire and make the art more enticing and harder to control. In the end, the desire for capital and money meant a pivot of strategy. Crowds began to desegregate, miscegenation occurred with significant consequences, of course, but most interestingly, we saw the ultimate strategy was cheap imitation.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, yes, that's right, Elvis Presley.
Like Elvis or Jerry Lee Lewis or Led Zeppelin. White artists who took these same musical styles, often the same exact songs, and tried to reproduce them, which for lots of white folks worked just fine. Elvis and these other men did their best imitation of the rock and roll energy that their black inspirations came from, and for the most part, it worked. Those who knew saw the difference, but those men and their contemporaries became megastars to white audiences at the time without having to worry about black men at the forefront. And this is not to say that those white men didn't craft their own unique sex appeal for generations in America, but those who embodied that rebellious spirit of rock and roll would become the most desired men for generations going forward and be paid handsomely for it, while most of the black men they pulled that inspiration from played second fiddle.
They suggested that when I was abroad, I spoke out against injustices to the Negro people in the United States. I certainly did.
Because of his deep-seated commitment to his ideals throughout his career, Paul Robeson found himself a hotly disputed figure and also ostracized. And that places him in a line of many high-profile black athletes and public figures, actors, performers who have spoken out and have found themselves being frozen out.
But not all of them, and we'll come back to that. Undaunted by the Columbusing of rock and roll, black men moved on to soul, funk, and R&B. The sex didn't stop. Classic hits were made, drugs were done, sex was had, and your grandma may have thrown her panties on the stage. This spilled into disco, which finally began to more openly include women and queer black men. Rock and roll was chugging along, and despite its pirated origins, you can't deny that the folks that took it over weren't growing in art form and making amazing music. Led Zeppelin may have stole the soul, but the shit goes. It is what it is. And black folks had moved on to disco, soul, and R&B and were making amazing music. On some level, in a weird way, everything was kind of going great until, sadly, as much as I hate to say it, as weird as it's gonna sound coming from me, hip hop kind of ruined everything.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge.
If you know me, then you know I obviously don't say that as a hater of hip hop or one of those respectability politics type people. If you follow my channel, you know I love hip hop. I'm a product of hip hop's best era in the 90s. But with the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see how hip hop truly stifled black men's sexuality in a way that I don't think we fully unpacked yet. Back in the day, for that entire time, even with the horrors of slavery still scarred on their backs, and the persistent threat of white supremacist structures seeking to control and stifle black men's sexuality, black men still wielded their sexuality with a sense of agency, variety, and sensuality. We gave pleasure, we received pleasure, we made love, we laid pipe, we seduced, and we inspired. All of this through some of the most difficult periods of civil unrest, urban decay, and black struggle. But when hip hop came along, I feel like the forces of white commodification evolved and finally found a way to neutralize black men's sexuality in a way that they couldn't for generations. All of that variety and sensuality and pleasure was eroded until only one feature of black men's sexuality was left: our image as dominant males. Gone were the images of heartthrobs and ladies' men. The songs about rocking and rolling and making love were reduced to fucking and sucking. We were back to being bucks or studs in many ways, except we seem to see it as a product of our own evolution and not fully recognize it as an image manufactured by these record labels.
Jamaica has the greatest concentration of Christian churches in the world, which ties into the Christianity and the slave master and the slavery that the Caribbean and our people have been oppressed by, which is, I studied the buck breaking and entire, black men would be and abused in front of the other slaves. This is the core, the absolute core of black men in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, being it is a form of weakness to bow cat and to go on your knees and to give oral sex to another person or to even receive anal penetration, that too. And they're just any sexual act where I'm not the dominant person receiving is submissive and weak and you're a loser if you do it. I've seen Jamaican men who are I don't eat bananas. And I'm yo, bro.
Bananas are delicious.
Yeah, for real.
The gangster archetype brought into supremacy by NWA in the late 80s became the primary archetype of how black men were seen and eventually presented in the world of pop culture. And this is partially because this image was very handsomely rewarded in a lot of ways. Stars in this thug image were being made in music, but also in the movies. We saw the hood movie wave start in the late 80s and early 90s. And being able to pull off this thug identity in real life made you cool, it made you respected, and it made girls like you. I remember growing up in the suburbs on the south side of Chicago and genuinely considering about whether or not to join a gang after finding out that one of my crushes was in the gang, a gang that neither of us had any business being in the south suburbs of Chicago. But that's the funny thing, because I and most of my peers were not in the same Chicago as a Yummy Sandifer, where gang affiliation was so much more significant. But we were so inundated with the imagery apart from the consequences that we didn't know any better a lot of times. This imagery stripped away the color, creativity, and beauty and variety that black men were able to display in those previous generations and just left the aggressive and the stoic. This image was sexualized though, but I'd argue that this imagery didn't serve black men well because it championed us disabusing ourselves from pleasure and limiting ourselves in our own agency. Sex in this image probably was closer to that buck stud embodiment, where we may offer pleasure to those who seek to consume us, but we were denying that to ourselves because that wasn't how real men acted. When you examine the way that hip hop has traditionally talked about sex, it lacks a discourse on giving and receiving pleasure and greatly focuses on how black men's masculinity and sexuality can be used to control, dominate, and display power, consuming the bodies of women for our financial benefit or status, but not because of actual pleasure, just proof of masculine prowess.
I mean, honestly, when I came out of Clark, and I met my son's mother, I did want to do the whole traditional, okay, I had one woman, we get married, and we go the long haul, you know what I'm saying? But that ended up not working out, and honestly, man, it broke my heart. It kind of, I think it hardened me up. I was like, man, and it made me say, I ain't gonna, in them moments of feeling that pain or that breakup and, it not working out, I think it scarred me to the point where I was like, I ain't never letting this happen to me again. You know what I'm saying? I am never gonna allow myself to love a woman so much to the point where now if it doesn't work out, I could barely move, I could barely breathe. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. No, I'm not, because as a man, I didn't want to feel vulnerable. I didn't want to feel weak or soft or dependent on a woman. I felt like I couldn't move without this woman.
Hip hop also amplified homophobia and queerphobia in the community. If there's one video I wish I could go and revisit, is actually my video on buck breaking. I made it very early in my making videos on camera career, and right after watching the documentary, which made me so angry that I didn't take the time that I would now to truly rewrite and rethink and research homophobia the way I would today. ideally I would be more careful about certain tropes about homophobia in Black communities, because although homophobia definitely is a problem in Black communities, it is still intrinsically linked to colonization and Christianity with colonized people.
I'm in a very privileged position. I love my family. I love them all. I'm very lucky. That being said, I'm not going to, like, none of us are perfect, and we all got work to do, and we all could be better, loving, more angelic, wonderful people. I preface all that to say, even my own mother has said homophobic stuff to me.
This is not to absolve Black people of our participation in homophobia, especially against our own people, but I would look closer to show how earlier generations differed in how queer Black people were treated. Queer Black representation seemed to increase over the course of the past few decades in terms of being more open, and with that there also seemed to be an increase in homophobic sentiment, something which I think it's safe to say hip-hop played a role in.
You just had to sit back and think, like, damn, you know, hip-hop really is about, it seemed like it's about, like, fighting for your rights in the beginning, about speaking your mind and about breaking down barriers or whatever. But everybody in hip-hop discriminates against gay people. To me, like, that's one of the standards of hip-hop, is to be like, yo, you fat, you gay. Matter of fact, the exact opposite word of hip-hop, I think, is gay.
But while still very much closeted in previous generations, the contributions and existence of queer Black men to the image of Black masculinity seem to be less intensely derided. We saw this in the arts with James Baldwin. Queer Black men were still often forced to closet their sexuality and surely were subjected to violence and ostracism, but from my perspective, there was a greater level of at least visual acceptance that seemed to be the norm going into the early 2000s. This again is all my perception as I personally think about these things and my own experiences looking back in hindsight. I'm more than open to being corrected on this perception. Feel free to toss any stories or literature that looks at Black queerness prior to the 80s to supplement what I've said here, and I'll make sure it gets in the description. Regardless, my point is that homophobia became a core feature of this erotic thug image that developed in tandem with hip-hop iconography. Now, at the time, I'm not saying that the erotic thug was the only image of Black man's desirability and sexuality, but it seemed to take precedent. And when you put it next to the ongoing issues of Black men's material conditions, which lacked access to money, education, health, etc., it was something that could be championed about us that couldn't be taken away. That erotic thug image made us special and desirable, sometimes explicitly because of our lack of material resources. Now, there were still other images of Black men's sexuality. The Denzel Washington and Wesley Snipes or Mario Van Peebles still held sway in images of Black masculinity, but at least for my generation, we didn't have a lot of variety. The most we got was the subtle sensuality of Tupac, as well as the subversive images of sensitivity and colorfulness in acts like PM Dawn or Arrested Development into Talib Kweli and eventually Kanye West, which is where we finally see things begin to open up and change again. But what felt like nearly 30 years, there was this clear flattening of Black men's sexual expression that is greatly still in effect today. The ramifications of this flattening are really complex and require us to look deeper into things we've become comfortable with deriding about Black men. And to explain this, I want to talk about DaBaby. DaBaby reflects issues of modern Black masculinity in a lot of ways. I find it odd that as DaBaby's antisocial behavior has become harder and harder to ignore, the same antisocial behavior that made him rich and famous, mind you, he has suddenly become emblematic of a problem of Black men. I get why this is the perception. He is a Black man. He is exhibiting the types of antisocial behaviors Black men are stereotypically known for and in rare cases rewarded for. But I challenge the oversimplicity of this distinction. While DaBaby reflects issues of modern Black masculinity in a lot of ways, what's missed is that DaBaby, from my perspective, is not championed or loved by Black male hip hop fans. He doesn't really represent us in many ways, and I'd argue that he isn't all that appealing to Black men as a whole. Everything I've ever known and understood about DaBaby, including his blow up, tells me that his audience is mainly women, probably queer men, and definitely white men. I'm old, so of course I may be out of touch, maybe I missed something. But as far as I can tell, for lack of a better way of putting it, young niggas ain't listening to the baby, Lil Baby maybe. And I think it's because of his over-the-top sexualization of this erotic thug aesthetic he's displayed in his branding and his music. In fact, I recall that a lot of black men, for maybe not the best reasons, being anti-fans of the baby as he rose to fame, claiming that the baby's overt performance of chivalry and wholesome masculinity in conjunction with his antisocial behavior and that erotic thug aesthetic could not really be real. It couldn't hold up over time, which it clearly hasn't. And if I'm not mistaken, he didn't really blow up till he started hanging with Meg Thee Stallion, who he eventually betrayed. And clearly Meg Thee Stallion's fan base is more female and queer. When you watch the baby's videos, his Instagram lives, when you hear his lyrics, I hear a savvy man who is definitely selling black thug sex appeal.
But bitch, I wanna kill. Kept getting blessed, cause bitch, I hustle. I ain't wanna steal. I whip this bitch out now in front of all these cameras, niggas know what it is.
His smile and his ability to perform hypermasculinity. In his videos, he is the center of his content, often objectifying himself, but not through the sexual gaze that we often see women through, but one that displays his dominance and prowess as a black man, one that makes him look like a buck.
So many black people don't think about sex pleasurably, but it's that same thing going on when I was telling you about repression. It's what we don't acknowledge that we want and we like and we want to explore, but black people have this pride. We can't be weak. We can't be seen as unassuming or like things not being known to us. I can't let anybody be aware of the ignorance I have of my own pleasure. So I just act like everything's fine. I go on business as usual and you know, act out sex, act out, you know, what we perceive will give us pleasure. But we're just running around in a circle trying to heal that repression while running from it at the same time. Yeah. So when we get little grasps of it, moments of it, that's where the baby type of energy is attractive.
I don't blame him for this. It works. It'd be nice if all the other stuff wasn't there, but I tend not to complain about men getting their money, but it does annoy me that I don't think people recognize that this is what he's doing. It's emblematic of the limitation we often have in understanding black men, because from my perspective, the baby's behavior and success isn't a condemnation of black men. It's a condemnation of everyone else who desires exactly what he's selling and hasn't sat with their own complicitness in making him and the image he represents valuable. One of my favorite bell hooks quotes is,
"Black males today lie in a world that pays them the most attention when they are violently acting out."
And it speaks to the symbiotic reality that for all the denigration and concern everyone seems to have for black male dysfunction, there's just as much, if not more, desire for that same behavior's consumption. In fact, those two things are intrinsically linked. The world still wants the buck. A black man whose mythological masculine performance can be desired, enjoyed, displayed, but also somehow controlled. I'm not okay with the baby's homophobic outbursts or numerous violent acts, but from my perspective, that's what you bought into from day one with him. It's not like with Kanye West, where I became a fan of the backpacking, conscious, sensitive guy, and then a decade later, he's a sleazy Trump voter that has a lot of other issues. The baby's earliest viral moments were him standing up to a mob threatening him in Atlanta all by himself. Numerous videos of him assaulting people. And that one picture where he wore a diaper. And years later, he's the most streamed artist in the country with music that could best be described as listenable. And for all the talk of canceling, I don't think he slowed down all that much. Despite the controversy from last year, he still had nearly 3 billion streams without dropping an album. And again, I don't think those streams are coming from just cishet black men. This is the paradox of how I see black men in the media eye who have misbehaved, and how in some, not all, but some cases, there's conflicting elements in play that we don't talk about. These men are idolized, fetishized, and handsomely rewarded for embodying the buck role. But the consequences of playing that role often spill out into transgressive and abhorrent behavior. I don't condone the behavior of these men, but I feel like we're not being serious about addressing said behavior's market value and why it keeps coming up. To put it simply, I watched a live stream from Kim Foster a while back where she said something along the lines of, patriarchy is bad, even the parts you like. And I felt that in my soul. But that said, the baby works partially because he's unique to an extent in 2022. He's kind of a throwback to that late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s era. Because ever since Kanye reimagined idealized black masculinity in the 2000s, something that I talked about in my Kanye videos, a lot of that variety of expression has returned to black men, especially in the last decade, as millennial and Gen Z boys and men have emerged to take hold of popular culture and, while still having a lot of issues, have reinstalled some of what was lost. But before I move into that, I do want to point out that we still had some black men during that era that rebelled against the flattening of their art.
Here in London for the first time to perform for you live, Johnny Vulture, Benjamin Andre, Dookie on drums, Possum Jenkins, and Andre Ice Cold 3000.
Andre 3000 is one half of the legendary rap duo Outkast, one of the top 2 musical groups of all time with the Beatles, and they ain't number 2. Outkast started out safely in the mold of rap aesthetics at the time, which allowed them to change hip-hop in 1994 with Southern playalistic Cadillac funky music, but rap was still very much in its kayfabe era, and Andre 3000 was no different. But come the second album, Three Stacks began to experiment with the imagery and expressions of black masculinity more typical of the 60s and 70s, specifically the funky aesthetics of legends like Parliament and George Clinton and Jimi Hendrix or the Isley Brothers. By the time their third album came around, Andre had completely shed the normative image of stoic urban aesthetics and adopted high fashion, colorful flamboyance, and a slightly queer or androgynous image, something that was unheard of in the late 90s, and it was at this point that he truly became the black male sex symbol of my generation.
For one, I'd argue that Andre 3000 is more of a real man than the baby is. You have to, if you're stuck in that one thug area of your life, you have not gotten to a point where you have mastered that, where you realize that there's more to being a man than to being an N-word. You know what I'm saying? There's more to being a man than being an N-word. And so I believe that the baby is still in that younger part of life where he hasn't gotten that confidence that he thinks he has. You still gotta reach for these or reach for the thing, or you gotta travel with 30 dudes. And that's because your image of yourself or what being a man is flawed. You have not matured to that other part of life. And money does do it, security does do it, but there's something else that happens.
In the small, brief moments of visibility he's spoken to, the guys do not want me to finish this video. It's nighttime now. The rain is gone. The kids are asleep, and I took my hair down because I was about to go to sleep too. But instead, we're gonna get this done. On top of this, Andre's lyrical content became more sensual and erotic. So much of his content was about the matters of the heart, to the point that in their 5th studio album, he decided to make an entire album's worth of material around his experiences with love and sex and heartbreak. Unlike the raunchy discourse of sex found in DaBaby's content, Andre 3000's content was often about mutual pleasure, mutual feelings of desire, and falling in love or being heartbroken. The paradox of how love brings you joy and pain. Then at the height of his popularity and after teasing a future career in Hollywood possibly, Andre pretty much left the public eye. He stopped making music on his own, only appearing sporadically as a guest artist on other people's songs, often stealing the show. But in between, he avoided making music, avoided the spotlight altogether. In small, brief moments of visibility, he's spoken to just feeling uninterested and maybe even uncool, that creating in a time that has passed him by just didn't feel right, which I find admirable.
What's your process like making music these days? Do you make much? Not so much? How would you say?
I haven't been making much music, man. My focus is not there. My confidence is not there. I tinker a lot. Mm-hmm. Like I'll just go to a piano and I'll set my iPhone down and just record what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Move my fingers around and whatever happens. But I hadn't been motivated to do a serious project. I'd like to, but it's just not coming. In my own self, I'm trying to figure out where do I sit. You know, I don't even know what I am, and maybe I'm nothing. Maybe I'm not supposed to be anything. Maybe you know, my history is kind of handicapping in a way.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to find out what makes me feel the best right now.
Yes.
And what makes me feel the best is when I just do these random kind of instrumental kind of things. You know, they make me feel the most rebellious.
Yes.
You know, I don't know, I have a really rebellious spirit. I don't like to go with the flow, really. I don't know why.
Yes.
But I just feel best when I don't.
Yes.
You know, so I have to honor that.
I completely understand.
I have to honor that in a way, you know?
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Instead of forcing himself to adapt an image that he didn't feel was naturally his, he resigned himself to appreciating the glory of his past and residing in the peace of his present. This form of radical self-actualization and rejection of social expectations is probably what many women saw in Andre 3000 that made him so appealing. It's the same energy that he put into so many of his cleverest rhymes. Andre 3000 is tall, yes, but physically he's not Idris Elba or Trevante Rhodes. He doesn't have Reggie Bush's facial structure or The Rock's arms. He doesn't tower over anyone or have a bunch of cool tattoos. His appeal wasn't physical, it was in his spirit and confidence. Not a showy machismo, but an intense sense of understanding of himself. Something I also would attribute to my friend D.
Miraculous part about it, because I was the quiet guy, girls started liking that stuff. They started liking, oh, he's mysterious or he's sexy. And I'm like, man, it ain't because I'm trying to be all that. I feel low-key awkward about that stuff. And then it worked for me. You know what I'm saying? Girls started liking that stuff. So I will say that there is something to, like, I think I learned early on that women like a mysterious kind of, some girls and women, they like a mysterious kind of, not hear them before you see them kind of guy. You know what I'm saying? Like, they like some type of mystique to you, like, ooh, what's to this guy? I don't know. He doesn't wear everything on the sleeve to the point where I know everything about him. And I think that's what, you know, you could be cute, but I think it adds to your cuteness, or it adds to your little muscle that you might have. For me, and I'm at a point now where I'm being honest about it. You know what I mean? I used to do the lying and conniving and whatever, but at this point in the game, I think, like we talked about, a lot of women like to see that manly man. It ain't just about muscles and gold chains and, you know, beards, but it's about, honestly, the most manliest thing we could ever do is be honest. You know what I'm saying? Like, man, and even if it's something that a woman may not want to hear, it might turn her on that you kept it a hundo with her. Like, man, hey, so yeah, I am seeing other women. You are? I can't believe that. I am. And I don't intend on stopping to seeing them, because I mean, yeah, I love our time, but at the same time, I'm enjoying what I'm doing.
Right.
And she might say you an asshole and all this, but then next week, so hey, what's up? Or she might say I'm cool on you, but you at least have given her the opportunity to make the best decision with the correct information.
The world wanted him to keep entertaining and putting on a show for them. The world wanted him to perform this mythical black masculinity for it. But Andre has so much effortless appeal and so little interest in doing what the world wants that the world ends up taking whatever they can get from him. Andre shows us that regardless of the black male image in hip hop that he was a part of, he and other black male figures managed to resist confinement to the framings of how black masculinity was meant to present itself. Resisted images of black men as without art or without nuance or without beauty. No matter what system sought to tamp down on black manhood, that variety that existed in pre-colonial Africa keeps managing to find its way back into our world. However, to focus on these triumphs is not to tell the full story. The sad reality is that while there are icons of black masculinity that provide vibrant examples throughout time of what we are capable of, there are many black men who aren't stars or celebrities that have found ways to express themselves and find sexual freedom in a world that seeks to bar them from it. Many black men still are in a constant state of turmoil around their sexuality, trying to find their footing between limitations of their racial identity and the desires of their humanity. The trappings of masculinity still lead to black men feeling stifled sexually, as well as ostracized and marginalized by the greater society. Pretty much every marker of sexual health for black men greatly lags behind men of other ethnicities, which is typical when looking at other social factors along racial lines. Black men's lack of access to economic capital limits their romantic partnerships and can often yield to them being stuck in patterns of short-term physical couplings. Black men find themselves more likely to be passed on using online dating apps, and in general, the public perception of black men seems to be in a persistent state of conflict as black men are constantly inundated, surrounded, and participating in negative images of themselves that often drown out the positive ones. And the kicker is that unlike white men, these negative images are basically required to represent all black men as opposed to being individual actions. Black men who socially transgress or misbehave are seen as the norm, and the deviant black men are the black men who are the good ones. And those men are celebrated as if they are not the vast majority, which literally statistically they are. And this harkens to the complexity of how we see and experience and report and talk about the sexual deviance and violence that black men are a part of. It's no secret that black women have the highest murder rate of all women in America, and that is essentially the result of their close proximity to poverty where they reside with black men. Now, the core explanation of that statistic is poverty. Pretty much all forms of crime rise with the poverty rate. But that element of the equation, the fact that it's the causal relationship between poverty and proximity that causes that statistic, is not really what takes center stage when something happens to a black woman. They don't flash poverty on the screen. They put a black man's mugshot.
Just like these young girls that get molested, it's the same thing operating and the same thing acting out, except that, women who act out hypersexually from being abused get labeled as hoes and tossed in the gutter, even though every nigga trying to run after her behind closed doors. Why? Because they're vibrating on the same energy, but the world view and what's the popular opinion, what's status quo, doesn't allow for that. You had enough of this shit. It is starting to, it's hard to not talk in circles about it because it's so much of the same, shit and everything that we've brought up.
Regardless of one's best intentions, the image of the black male sexual brute is impossible to disentangle from all black men's experience. And this image is not without unintended consequences, even as we report it as gently as possible. And this makes that phrase, not all black men, not as pithy of a comeback as people might think, because no, when you talk about black men, the sad reality is that it's always all black men if it's something bad. And this is not me saying we shouldn't speak truth to power or hold black men accountable publicly, even when possible. It's just to speak on those not all black men who still feel stigmatized by these images. But I get that on the whole, this creates a nearly impossible balancing act that I'm going to ask again that you give me the grace to discuss as best as I can, because the nuance here to go between black men as violators and as the violated and everything in between, it's tough. For example, I'm going to take a moment to talk about false accusations of sexual assault, which are rare. And I want to be clear on that up front so that this next piece of information has the appropriate context. While very rare, when false allegations happen, and they do happen, in those cases, black men are 3 times as likely to be falsely accused of sexual assault as white men. And there's probably a lot more to unpack around that statistic as it pertains to race of the accusers or judges or arresting police officers, but I don't have the stomach to even dig deeper into it.
Brianna Harmon Talbot claimed 3 black men grabbed her, forced her into a van, and raped her. 2 weeks later, she's in jail for making a false report.
Still, when I looked this up, I had never looked this statistic up before, so I didn't know what I would find, but I knew what I would find. It's something I think a lot of not all black men feel innately, that our sexual activity carries with it an implication of threat, in that in the face of the criminal justice system, in terms of sex, our word and possible innocence doesn't have much power. And this complicates the nature of intimate partner violence and sexual violence whenever you're involving Black men and Black women, because this also is something that Black women are aware of. Studies on experiences of sexual violence and intimate partner violence for Black women indicate that they underreport their experiences of sexual violence because they, much like Black men, fear that the police won't believe them or that they may overreact when they actually do respond. It becomes a situation where Black men and women end up highly vulnerable to the worst behavior and actions from one another. No other racial group of men in America is as exposed to sexual violence as Black men. And this isn't just a consequence of male child predators who seek out vulnerable Black boys. And this isn't just in prisons where sexual violence happens and Black men are disproportionately represented. This is an issue of being groped in public by women and men alike. This is an issue of being harassed and pressured into concerning or dangerous sexual situations by paramours who can't believe that a Black man would pass up on a sexual encounter. And more significantly, this is an issue of an unseen epidemic of Black boys whose first sexual encounters are with adult women in their own communities. And I'm saying that, and just please respect the fact that I'm saying first sexual encounters, because in my experience talking to other Black men whose first sexual experience was technically an act of statutory rape, a lot of them don't like to characterize it in that way. And even though I disagree, I'm trying to be respectful.
And then you're engaging in these sexual activities with these boys, because men are thought to believe that anything sexual, even fathers are telling their 2-year-old sons, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old sons, that whole rhetoric, that whole conversation. Yeah. So in a man's mind, he's groomed to believe that he's entitled to feminine attention and sexuality, that he practically owns it, So these women taking advantage of these boys, because boys are boys and we got the hormones and all this other shit.
Right.
That shit's raging. So some older attractive lady coming on to you, even if you're nervous, even if you're insecure, even if you're not even functioning yet, it's still intriguing to you. And you're still not gonna turn it down because you ain't no bitch, you ain't no punk ass nigga, you ain't never gonna show weakness. So you can't let nobody. So instead of talking about it from a point of being violated, you completely bypass that to act as a victor, to denounce your victim.
The data on Black boys who are sexually assaulted as children by women, or the Black men who are coerced into sex and or violated as adults, is lacking in analysis and depth, and I just don't have enough expertise to feel confident enough deep diving into what these numbers mean, but they are out there. The reason that they are not really present, that there's not a wealth of data on this information, is multitudinous, but it comes down to is that people don't take the sexual violation of Black men seriously. Consider the story of Terry Crews. In the middle of the Me Too movement, Terry Crews came forward about being groped in public by a powerful white male producer.
In 2016, while at a party with my wife, I was sexually assaulted by a successful Hollywood agent. The assault lasted only minutes, but what he was effectively telling me while he held my genitals in his hand was that he held the power.
And while he told his story of his assault, he was constantly met with derision that he, as a big, strong Black man, should have handled it.
Terry Crews spoke out on Good Morning America this morning, alleging he was sexually assaulted last February. Okay, this is not even Terry at 8. This is Terry, full-form man, on Brooklyn 911. I was asked in my meeting this morning, do I think it was brave of him to come out? I said, no, it's not brave. He's just talking.
I don't understand. I think that now everybody's so into this notion that it happened to me too. Hey, motherfucker, God gave you muscles so you could say no and mean it.
What do you mean it happened? And this was a little bit from everyone. It wasn't a universal sentiment, but there were a lot of people that looked at Crews as a big, strong Black man and said that he must have liked it because he didn't do anything about it. And Crews met this criticism despite the fact that his attacker was a powerful white man who were the core targets of Me Too at the time.
I felt like I could punch a hole in his head. This is the thing, if I would have just retaliated in defense, I would be under the jail right now. And that's one thing I knew, that being a large African-American man in America, I would immediately be seen as a thug.
You have to ask yourself, would anyone have even taken his story seriously at all if his abuser were a woman, especially a white woman? Because I've had multiple experiences of sexual violation and harassment at the hands of white women. I've been groped in public on numerous occasions. I've had drunk white women violate my personal space and try to straddle me in public and at clubs. And when they get rejected, they create a scene. In each of these situations, my response has always been incredibly passive, because I innately know that if conflict arises, there's no possibility that my safety will be as protected as the women who are violating me. And I imagine that to an extent, many of these types of women low-key feel emboldened to act in such a way because there are no consequences for it. At the same time, I also can't ignore a culture surrounding sex and black men that definitely encourages this type of behavior. A lot of times when we talk about double standards for sexual violation of boys, for example, the regular stories that we see of female teachers molesting their male students and getting caught, incels and bad faith actors only want to point out the very valid fact that it is a double standard of how these incidents are glossed over when the victim is a male and the perpetrator is a female. I agree that it's not met with the appropriate level of outrage. But the other thing to recognize is that when you look in the comment section of any one of those stories, you're sure to see a comment that says something like, "I wish she was my teacher," or "Where were teachers like this when I was in middle school?" What I'm getting at is that whenever we talk about these double standards around sexual violence, we can't stop recognizing that we're talking about systems of patriarchy that make it possible.
Miss Grundy? Hey.
Archie, what are you doing walking in this heat?
In fact, it's patriarchal beliefs that make it so difficult for men, especially black men, to be taken seriously as victims because men, people born with penises, are not capable of being victims under patriarchy. The penis, the phallus, is only to be an instrument of violation, not possibly to be violated. So for all my consternation and concerning about women being overly aggressive or outright assaulting me, there's tons of black men that I remember in those very same nights that clearly loved and wished they got that type of attention and buy into their own racist sexual mythology. And in a perfect world, I wouldn't judge those men who enjoy that type of attention, inviting the sexual gaze or even indulging in taboos or fetishes between consenting adults. That's dope. Do that all day, but recognize that in a system that ungenders and disempowers black men, where many black men are reduced to their genitalia because their educational and economic value has been destroyed, you can't blindly indulge in that type of behavior uncritically.
It's almost like when they say that broke niggas got the best dick. Well, it's because this is all I got. And you ain't gonna call me, if I got good dick, I'm not a whack nigga. I'm just broke, but I'm still desirable. I still have value. I'm gonna knock this shit out the park. And that means I still have value because anything else on me, anybody else has. But if I can knock this out the park, I have value. You understand what I'm saying? And I think that black men try to find worth in something. We need to find some type of worth somehow, somewhere, because we don't feel it innately in ourselves that just being a human being is valuable.
I am pro-sex work, but I've also worked in anti-sex trafficking organizations. And the thing that a lot of pro-sex work people miss that I've often seen is that it's not just sex work, it's a sex economy. It's a sex industry under capitalism. And what that means is that there's plenty of room for people to be alienated from their work, even if their work is their body. So in a perfect world, women would have the option to get into sex work with full agency and in safe environments. But when you have to get into sex work in lieu of other opportunities due to dire circumstances, when the sex worker is almost always in a position subordinate to the sex buyer because there's a complete power imbalance, yeah, that's not the socialist reality that we're actually working toward.
New challenger.
All right, so we're here on the extra grainy editing cam because the other computer is acting a little funny. Either way, I wanted to take a second to talk about somebody who is at least on the first version of this thumbnail, because y'all know I changed my thumbnails, and that's the Big Woody or Barry Wood meme. If you were paying attention to the internet in kind of like the beginning of COVID, is from what I remember, is when I first saw this. It's like somehow this meme got really popular with COVID. It's an image of a large black man sitting on a bed, naked, and his penis has been photoshopped to absurd proportions. I hate to burst anybody's fetishistic bubble, but no, that is not the size of that man's actual penis. To me, this story is fascinating because it's emblematic of what was just said in the video in terms of how, as much as I like to champion sex work or whatever type of kink you're into, whatever type of taboo you're into, that we often leave out material conditions and economic disparity, like makes the, I don't want to say glamorization of sex work, but our desire to just nobly look at sex work as an awesome thing that adults should be able to do, to not shame it as legitimate labor, which I believe in, but I haven't heard enough people talk about the nature of sex work being very inclined to exploitation and how it preys upon people in need. And so this picture in particular, to me, it probably birthed this video, which is, I can't believe I ended up not talking about it in the original version of the script, because this man's image, that image in particular, came from like a gay porn magazine, which is fine. The thing that bothers me is, one, that people Photoshop the image to make it even more absurd, that image then, has expanded into this absurdity to become a meme, kind of disembodying him from his own body, that man had died years before this meme went viral in 2020. And like, if you Google that meme now, you can get t-shirts and soap dispensers and light switches and all kinds of crazy shit. And I don't know if his family's seeing any money from that man's image. And the thing is that there's a video I'll link in the description. I'll probably flash a piece of it here, that talks about how he only did this photo shoot because he was a straight man, but he was actually very religious, but he was down on his luck. He was having financial troubles, and another guy that shot for this, porn magazine said, hey, if you want to make some quick, easy money, here's a opportunity to do something. And he did it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, in practice, but it's that intersection of, we have this desirable black male body that is uninterested in this type of sex work that is, and is not so much coerced, but pushed into it via dire material needs that are systemically barred from him. And he did it, and the actual photo shoot is 2012, and somehow later in life, after he's gone, this image is now the image of who he was. It gives me vibes from Sarah Bartman's story, who is a black woman who, much akin to this man, was a sideshow because of her body, whose sex organs and pieces of her body were preserved and put in museums after she died. It just kind of engages with the heavy totality of how nothing is safe to do in a black body, that everything you're doing is an act of bravery. It's a leap of faith to wonder where, when, and how you might be exploited beyond a scope that you could have imagined. So yes, I just want to make sure I mentioned that, because that story stuck with me for a while and somehow, died when it came time to put pen to paper for this video. But yeah, I'm talking about it here. So back to the video. Similarly, I would love if black men who felt good when their bodies and penises were celebrated and fetishized and admired and desired were able to do that without having to think about the fact that those same features are what police say scared them for their lives when they started shooting.
Shots fired, male down, black male, maybe 20, black revolver, black handgun.
Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old, died later in hospital. His family wanted these recordings released, and the police obliged.
This issue also needs to be examined from the perspective of how it damages black men into adulthood. I've mentioned before the rolling list of problematic black men such as R. Kelly, Lil Wayne, DaBaby, Nick Cannon, Chris Brown, etc. I've mentioned in previous videos that many of these men had their first sexual experience as boys by women. Things that should be technically considered assault, but patriarchy didn't allow them to see it as such.
It never felt like I was doing something wrong. I mean, technically she could have went to jail. You know, I'm not gonna say her name, but then I'll be 17 talking to a woman that was 38, and she got a daughter that's 15. It just became like my first tattoo right here on my shoulder. Here you are, you a young stallion, you know what I'm saying, you young, robust, and you know what I'm saying, they want to take care of you. And when I got my first tattoo, the woman told me, she was like, the reason I'm getting you this tattoo, and it was like $200, which to me at the time was like $1 million. Like, damn, she about to pay $200 for me to get this tattoo. But she said, she was like, man, I want, whenever you look at that tattoo, I want you to think of me. You know what I'm saying? Like that I was the person that gave you this. And here it is, 20 years later, now I'm telling my brother about that whole, and here I am thinking about her again. So, but wild. And we would have sex in the car. I don't even know all of the psychological effects and whether it be good or bad that, me dealing with older women has had on me. You know what I mean? But I do know that when I would, let's say, I'm kicking it with this 28-year-old, then a 35-year-old and a 38-year-old, now, like, I've grown up a lot faster than a lot of my guys who might be 16 and 17. I'm drinking, I'm smoking, you know what I'm saying? Like, cause these are the things that they do.
Now, of course, every black man with that experience doesn't grow up to have explicit issues with women, but the removal of that innocence at such a young age for these boys has a potential to be damaging in many ways in the long run. A 2008 paper on sexual debut found that for men, early sexual debut predicted greater issues with sexual health later in life, such as mixing sex with illicit substances, risky sexual activity, a high number of sex partners, or possibly, paradoxically, impotence. There's a lot to the state of sexual health for black men that is greatly lacking in study and attention from the academy and the social sciences and public policy, but it's not completely invisible in academic study. Sexual health is a focal point of the aforementioned Tommy Curry and numerous prominent scholars who have studied black masculinity, from Bell Hooks to Anthony LaMelle Jr., have also talked about this. And if my own personal circle is any indication, as well as the types of channels and people that I've been helping to promote and talk about on YouTube, the sentiment is growing. Dr. Candace Owens, who is a friend of mine that has appeared in a few older videos, is an associate professor at the University of Kentucky who studies sexuality and just started a research project on this issue, where the first set of data that she collected found that 40% of the black men she surveyed were victims of some form of sexual violence. There is hope, but it faces challenges. Going back to something I said earlier, the biggest challenge to me is, are people ready to engage with seeing black men as possible victims? Or are people so invested in the mythology of black men's sexuality that they will reject healthier black men in favor of the myths, in favor of the myths that they crave? Can and will black men take initiative and agency and lead on these issues, make safe and productive spaces to address these issues proactively and change the narratives around these problems while demanding to be humanized by our partners? Or will some men continue to indulge in the myth and or allow this movement to be co-opted by bad faith actors who take these issues and, instead of addressing the core problems behind these issues, weaponize them against black women? I've mentioned Tommy Curry a lot for this video because I feel like his book, The Man Not, is probably one of the more important books that you'll read about black masculinity.
Your whole life changes when you hear grown black men holding back tears or speaking through the pain of physical, sexual, or domestic abuse at the hands of black men and women who should have loved them, cared for them, or at the most basic level, not harmed them.
However, in my opinion, in this book, he is overly critical of black feminist theories, despite the fact that there's so much that aligns there, to the point where there's a lot of black male scholar fans that found me before I ever heard of Curry and just assumed I was a black male scholar, but you know. And you won't have to search Tommy Curry for long before you start getting sucked into the black manosphere, because he and his book have definitely found a home among certain niches of the black manosphere. And instead of focusing on the larger structural issue that caused these problems, they really just hyper-focus into Curry's arguments against black feminist thought, and to me loses the entire point of what that work really should be doing. But like I said before, the theorists are not meant to be idolized. Karl Marx was Karl Marx. That's a good meme. But like I've said before, the theorists are not meant to be idolized. Karl Marx was a fuckboy shirt coming soon. And this is the challenge that I'm hoping to put to everyone watching. Much as I said in the previous videos about the manosphere as a whole, it's important to expand the discourse around how we talk about black men so that the discourse is not dominated by the worst voices. A lot of times in my comments, I'll see people say something like, finally, a cishet black man is speaking about these types of issues in this way and it's not toxic, etc., etc. And I appreciate that. But I always push back to say that my attitude isn't so unique. I am not so special. The problem is we've allowed the worst voices to dominate this conversation on YouTube and TikTok and social media in general. And I know that part of this is just the way we talk about this topic. It's hard to talk about these issues effectively because for all our efforts to point out the problems that black men face, a lot of us aren't ready to fully engage with what those problems mean. A lot of us are deeply invested in the racist constructs around black men's sexual mythology. Black men, black women, and everyone else is complicit in the reproduction of these tropes, and the damage that's done is often rendered invisible. But here's the one scenario, ironically, that I think looking backward can maybe show us a way forward. Yes, those same ugly stereotypes existed 30, 40 years ago, but it does feel like we had more variety and vibrance in our expressions of self and sex and masculinity before we allowed hypermasculinity that was rewarded via hip hop to take over the tone. But we are more than capable of returning to not necessarily the exact image, but an image that provides more freedom and hopefully agency in how we are seen and how we see ourselves. And I feel confident about this because I think I see this a lot in our present. I look at the way that black men are expressing themselves today in the classic masculinity of Idris Elba, the colorful yet aggressive chaos of Toby Nguiwe, the brave fluidity of Lakeith Stanfield, the outright queer flamboyance of Billy Porter, the traditional African touches of the late Chadwick Boseman, the classic hip-hop aesthetics of Lil Baby, or the alternative image of Thundercat, and half of my homies here on YouTube. And yes, whatever the hell Kanye is doing these days. All these things are showing us that as black men, you may not feel like you have the room to express yourself in whatever way you desire, but you do. You have way more room than I had in the 90s, trust me. And this same thing stands when it comes to what's between your legs and what you decide to do with it. One thing I truly believe is that the people who love and desire black men, just like Andre 3000, may desire a specific image of black masculine mythology from you, and surely they will have options to find it out in the world if that's not something you're interested in giving. But as black men begin to reject certain mythologies, trust me, they will take what you have to offer. And if they don't want what you give, someone else does. And if we all collectively say, hey, Mandingo isn't on the menu anymore, trust me, they will adjust their taste buds. And if they don't want healthy and whole black men, fuck them, leave them alone anyway.
With all of my energy, this whole, the demasculation and the effeminization of the black man, I cannot stand that lie. I think it is a false fabrication. I'm like, yo, y'all are here saying that, oh, as soon as a black man puts on a dress, he becomes like, he's like, over by the Hollywood elite or whatever. Any human being that is able to express the entirety of the spectrum of humanity is a fully realized human. I've worn dresses and I won torn awards for them. And with my entirely still masculine black penis, and I had makeup on, so I didn't lose any of my masculine energy, and I was still able, and we had amazing sex, and I won a porn award for it, and I didn't wake up the next day 1% less of a man, or my balls didn't shrink or not. So there's levels. There's so many levels to the depths of unlearning that we have to do, and the power that we're losing in sexuality by thinking like eating pussy makes you weak or whatever.
Are you living life, or are you just a body? You know, acting out your subconsciousness and subconscious fears. So going deep into the spirituality and stuff like that, trying to know the truth about the world around me. I know the truth about myself and the people that I was attracted to. And from then in a space in my life, I was overcompensating for how misogynistic the world was. And I did used to censor the pleasure in my sexual experiences around making sure the other person was taken care of, whether or not I was or not. Even that gets tiresome too, because I'm still denying myself.
But like, I wish I would find out if when my I got 2 sons. I know you got sons. Let me find out there's like an adult woman, like getting at them. Exactly. It's gonna be flames. It's gonna be just like if it was a dude and I had daughters, because
I told my son the other day, I said, man, he was looking at this, we was walking down the street, he looking at this grown woman. I'm like, I don't know what you looking at her for. What you looking at her for? Well, no, you stay where you at. Them sophomores and juniors and seniors. But at the same time, I can't get mad at him.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because he looking at grown women. I literally in 4 years or maybe 6 years, my son went from going, ugh, when it talked about girls, yuck, to girls.
This isn't normal. Like, if I put this whole conversation out to the streets, like, a lot of people gonna be like, yo, who was y'all on? Y'all was on some I ain't with that.
They're like, oh, you weak men, y'all are weak.
Right. These people talking about their emotions for a whole hour.
Now y'all want to be coddled. Now y'all want to cry. You know what I'm saying? It's not about softening men up. It's about treating them, teaching them that it's okay to have feelings, be empathetic, treat people nicely. It doesn't make you soft. So women and your children benefit from these conversations. We've never had these conversations, and it makes you a worse man. Definitely. It makes you a better person to the people around you, the people that you care about, including yourself. These conversations make it possible for you to be human. These are the entryways to emotional intelligence. And that's a huge, huge thing. Knowing how the process was going on in yourself, in your mind, in your heart, and able to say it, express it, have conversations about it, get to a better place. Because historically, we're not able to do that. We just walk around and say, yo, I'm feeling this fury inside. I need to do something with it. Pow.
Right.
I feel better.
I feel better. Bust down.
Right. Yeah. Let me just express it through these things. And this conversation could go forever. But
this is powerful. And that's all I got. If you're in the mood to try something new after watching this, please again, check out the sponsor. If this video made you want to do some exploration with yourself or your partner, check out the sponsor. We're offering nice stuff. Please also remember to support this Patreon, and you might need to share this one because I doubt I'll be able to keep it monetized. So your support is definitely needed, but fingers crossed. That's all I got today for y'all. Peace.